Greetings, my lovelies. This is Blake here, and welcome to my review of Transformers 4 Age of Extinction. Now, I am not a fan of the Transformers movie franchise, but I do want to emphasize that I have no real nostalgic ties to the original Transformers media. Many people who grew up with the show or toys really think that Michael Bay took a giant dump on their beloved childhood. If I ever did collect the toys or watch the TV show, I have no real memories of them. Whereas with, Power Rangers or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, oh god, I have that to look forward to later this summer. I do have many fond memories of, and, they did play a major part in my childhood. Transformers not so much, so that won't affect my judgment in regards to any of the Transformers films. And I don't consider myself a highbrow critic. In fact, anybody who follows my reviews knows that I could have some pretty immature tastes. I'm really looking forward to The Expendables 3 because I loved the first two movies so much, and those are hardly the brainiest flicks out there. I'm easily entertained, I'm just not easily impressed. So I like dumb action movies, so you'd think I'd embrace the Transformers movie franchise. Well, I like dumb action movies, but I don't like annoyingly dumb action movies. All of Michael Bay's Transformers flicks have given me headaches. Now, in the case of the first two films, I actually do remember enjoying them more than not when I first saw them in theaters. But once the novelty of their strengths wore off, once I saw them again on DVD, I could only really pay attention to the flaws, which I noticed the first time I watched them, but I just either ignored or found them to be kind of amusing, like in the case of Transformers Heaven. I thought that shit was hilarious at first. Really, there's so many things I could describe about where Michael Bay went wrong with this franchise, and just tying into my previous point, I don't hate these films simply because Michael Bay is involved or because it's a Transformers movie. Michael Bay has done good stuff in the past, and once again, Transformers should be my cup of tea, but I don't like the real loud, annoying sense of humor that Michael Bay forces down our throats. I don't like the self-indulgence in regards to the characters and storylines. There's way too much shit going on in these movies. I do not like the overly long running time and the fact that they're very awkwardly paced. In each of these films, except oddly Transformers 2, I found myself getting bored long before the third act even began. Transformers 2 might be the most flawed of the Transformers movies, but I do think it is the best paced. In the case of Transformers 1, I actually remember falling asleep right before the third act began when I watched it in theaters, and I attributed that to me just not getting enough sleep the previous night. Well, then when I watched it again on DVD, the exact same thing happened at the exact same spot. So it just burnt out long before it ended. And in the case of Transformers 3, it just took way too long to get to the good stuff, instead focusing on the annoying antics of Shia LaBeouf. And then once the good stuff started happening, the action, it was just way too fucking late. So I was already burned out by the time that even started. So yeah, these are the reasons why I'm not a fan. But say what you will about the Transformers movies, every time I think I'm done with them, they always find a way to pull me back in. Transformers was not very good, but Transformers 2 had such a cool trailer that I started to really look forward to seeing the actual movie, even though it repeated itself. It wasn't very good, so I was done with Transformers. Then Transformers 3 ended up releasing one of the coolest trailers of all time, and so immediately I'm now really intrigued, and I thought that could have brought put the franchise back on track. It didn't. In fact, it's probably my least favorite Transformers movie. And then by then I was like, okay, screw it, I'm finished. I had a little bit of hope when it seemed like Michael Bay was going to leave and they were going to get a new director. I have nothing against Michael Bay, and I'd say, as much as I don't like the Transformers movie, I do understand that they have an appeal. They have a specific target audience, primarily young teenagers, which I am not. So I don't even hate the fact that he's involved. It just does not get me excited. But as much as I would have liked to have seen somebody else's interpretation of what a Transformers movie should be like, once Michael Bay came back on, that totally squashed my interest. But then the Super Bowl came around, and I saw that first TV spot and had Optimus Prime riding a freaking robotic dragon and wielding a robotic sword. God damn it, now I have to see this movie. It looks so freaking cool. I didn't realize at first that that was actually a Dinobot, which is strange because I actually do remember watching some of the Dinobots TV show and even collecting at least one of the toys. I was very fond of the Velociraptor Transformer. I can't think of his name. He was the one who started off as a villain but eventually became good. So that did get my interest. That seemed like enough of a gimmick to give me something new, so at least Transformers 4 would be different. But then the reviews started coming in, and it seemed like critics hated this movie even more so than its predecessors, which really freaking scared me. So my expectations dropped, all hope died, and I was so unenthusiastic about going to the theaters to watch this that I actually chose to skip it on Friday, which is usually when I see the new theatrical releases. But I ended up watching it on Saturday, and you know what? I actually kind of enjoyed myself. Now, make no mistake, this is not a good movie. In fact, I can't even call it a movie. It's product placement. It's designed purely so it could show products like Bud Light. In fact, that scene was so heavy-handed that I almost thought it was parody. So it was pretty shameless when it came to that kind of stuff. But if it's not selling, products like Bud Light, then it's just trying to get you to buy the toys, whether it's the Autobots or the Dinobots, whatever. In fact, the Dinobots are only there simply to sell toys. I'll go into that a little bit later. But that doesn't mean I can't have fun if it provides enough action sequences and the human-oriented scenes don't piss me off, which is the problem with the trilogy. Let me talk about why I liked this movie, even though it's not objectively necessarily better than its predecessors. For one, they focus more on the Autobots. Yes, there's a human story, and yes, it takes up quite a bit of screen time, but it seemed like the Autobots are introduced earlier, and they have a more consistent presence to where I felt that this movie was about them. It wasn't about Sam Witwicky, which is cool, and it also really helped that this is the first Transformers movie where I could actually tell all the Transformers apart. In previous films, I could only recognize Bumblebee and sometimes Optimus Prime, but otherwise they all just looked the same. I mean, if you showed me stills of all of them, I could probably point out the differences there, but when they're in motion, it's just really hard to pay attention to the details. So what I think they did here was they really amped up the color scheme, so, the green stands out a lot more, and another one, like in Bumblebee's case, how he's yellow, that's always why I could tell the difference between him and everybody else. Well, here it's just the colors stick out much more, so I could at least, I could tell who was who based on what color they were. But also, it just seemed like their designs were much more different, and their personality stood out a lot more. There's definitely a lot of racial stereotyping. The most blatant example is the samurai Transformer. But at least the racial stereotypes were never played for laughs. Were like, what were they called? Skids and Mudflap or whatever. They were so offensively stereotypical, but you were supposed to be laughing at them, but because they were so offensively stereotypical, you couldn't. They were really offensive and stereotypical. But in this case, like, whenever they do something or say something that's supposed to be funny, it could have been done by anybody else. So, like, the samurai robot has a scene where he says, they should do something without resorting to violence, and suddenly something pops out and he kills it. I mean, it's a predictable joke. I didn't really laugh at it, but at least that had nothing to do with the fact that he was modeled after a Japanese samurai. And you know, I actually enjoyed the interactions of the Transformers quite a bit. Their voices also stood out a lot more. I liked that they gave Optimus Prime a real character arc. In previous films, he was always there to just be a leader who, you know, gave foreboding or inspirational speeches. And that was fine. He had a certain presence to him that made that acceptable. But I felt over time he was becoming so ruthless, and they were never really acknowledging that. Like when he killed Megatron in Transformers 3, that was really cold, and I wouldn't have minded that if that had something to do with his character, but now it almost seems like it was foreshadowing how he will act in this movie. He has lost pretty much all faith in humanity, and he's much more cynical and angrier than he was in the previous movie, but at the same time, he is still the same character. He is very honorable. He can be very compassionate to those who deserve it, but his character arc is how he must once again learn to have faith in humanity. It's, you know, kind of cliched and predictable, and they definitely rushed through that character arc, but at least it was there. They were doing something different with Optimus Prime. So whereas I thought he was becoming more boring as the films went on, he suddenly recaptured my interest once more. The villain, Lockdown, awesome villain. He's very sinister. He has a very menacing presence, and he has a personality that stands out. Whereas with Megatron, I thought he was kind of cool at first, but he became more of a joke as the films progressed, where he'd constantly get his ass kicked almost immediately. The other villains, like I think Sentinel and the Fallen, they were just kind of boring and generic, but this guy, he really captured my interest. I thought he was the most compelling villain by far in all these films, and he stole the show whenever he'd be on screen, which is impressive considering he's a CGI effect. And then, you know, they bring back Megatron as Galvatron, and once again we could take him seriously. He is shown to be a threat, even though once again he's kind of the same character. But I wasn't always sure I liked how they were using him. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So that was the good stuff for me. Now when it came to the character-oriented sequences, they weren't compelling, but I could tolerate them. This was funny Mark Wahlberg, and not serious and boring Mark Wahlberg. I think Wahlberg has really good comedic timing, and this film utilizes that, and so he provided many funny and amusing moments. He struggles with the more dramatic bits, but I don't blame him as much as there wasn't a whole lot of time to flesh these moments out, so it's hard to really convey the right emotions when you only have about 10 seconds to do so. But still, you know, I enjoyed watching him enough. Now, his allies, whether it was his daughter or her boyfriend, I can care less about them. The boyfriend's characterization was very inconsistent. Sometimes he'd be real cool and brave and heroic, and other times he'd be kind of cowardly and goofy. It seemed like he would constantly change his personality based on what the movie wanted from him. And then the daughter was just really generic. The actress was actually Katara from the last Airbender movie. She does a lot better. I thought the acting was pretty much fine throughout this film, but the character, she could have easily been that same love interest from Transformers 3, and I would have bought it, because they were both very flat characters whose only attributes that stood out were the long blonde hair. So when it came to their interactions, it was a mixed bag. At least the daughter wasn't portrayed as overtly bitchy. I was expecting some sort of father must reconnect with his daughter storyline like 2012, but they didn't really go that route. Even though there's some friction, it never got on my nerves. But the problem with this movie is it's overindulgent. It's cramming in way too many subplots and characters, which was the same issue I had with the previous films. Now, when you look at the human characters, you have Mark Wahlberg as a struggling inventor who's, you know, has this drama with his daughter because she has a boyfriend that he didn't know about, so that creates some friction. But he ends up finding Optimus Prime and repairing him, and that gets him in trouble because now Kelsey Grammer, who's this big CIA bigwig, redundant word use on my part, he hates all the Transformers, and he's using, well, I won't go into that yet, I'm talking about the humans, but now he's hunting them down, and he has his own agenda. One thing I do like about the villains is even though you don't agree with what they're doing, you do understand why they're doing what they're doing. So there was a little bit of depth there, just a little bit. And Kelsey Grammer's character has a second in command who has also his own agenda. He has his own backstory where his sister was killed in Chicago, so he really hates Transformers. And he was played by the guy who was the Man in Black from Lost, I think. But then Kelsey Grammer is also working with Stanley Tucci's character. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that guy's name right, but he also has his own agenda. He and Kelsey Grammer do occasionally clash, and he's kind of the character who might become a villain or he might become a hero. You're not entirely sure. And I thought he was cool at first until the third act when he suddenly becomes a comedic relief character who's really goofy and hard to take seriously. Even though he's kind of eccentric and a little silly throughout the bulk of the movie, I could always take him seriously. So I felt they dropped the ball with him. And then he has two love interests who I have no idea why they didn't just combine the character into one, because neither was really necessary and both get way too much screen time. And then there's also bit characters that just show up for a scene or two who they could have easily trimmed out and the movie would have lost nothing. Like, Mark Wahlberg has a comedic relief friend. There's this Asian guy who for absolutely no reason decides to help out. That's the kind of stuff that Michael Bay and Ewan Kruger really need to learn to that it's not necessary for the narrative. The Transformers movie should not be over 2 hours. I mean, especially if this is appealing towards a younger teenaged audience, they're not going to have the attention span that everybody else does. So I don't know why they keep screwing that up, especially considering how many people have complained about the running time. Now, when it comes to the Transformers, well, you have the Autobots are now being persecuted by the government because the government's stupid and they didn't learn from their mistakes last time. So they're all in hiding, and I've already said, Optimus Prime's character arc is really into play here. But he's being hunted by Lockdown, the villain, who of course is working with Kelsey Grammer. But Lockdown is also working for somebody else whom they're really setting up to be a major force in Transformers 5, but don't really appear here. They're just talked about. They're the guys who created the Transformers. So there's that going on. Then Stanley Tucci's character rebuilt Megatron as Galvatron. But of course Galvatron is still Megatron deep down, so he's able to come back and have his own agenda. And of course he hates Optimus Prime and wants to take over the world using Transformers. So you have all sorts of different groups here, and then the Dinobots show up at the very end, but they weren't necessary at all. They contributed very little other than evening up the odds for the good guys, but they don't seem very strong. I mean, you had this big-ass T-Rex Transformer, but he gets his ass handed to him by Optimus Prime almost immediately. But they could have easily cut out the Dinobots, and they wouldn't have lost anything in regards to the narrative, but they're there to sell toys, as I said, and be kind of a gimmick to get the fans excited. So it's very, very convoluted. On a... God, what else can I say there? The dialogue is pretty bad. There's some lines that did make me groan. Usually it wasn't when it was trying to be funny, but when it was trying to be cool and badass, like, my face is my passport. That was when I kind of was like, oh my god, that was stupid. But I actually will concede that this film did have more success with its comedy than its predecessors had. In fact, I'd say it's comparable to at least Transformers 1, which I thought Transformers 1 had more funny moments than 2 and 3 did. This one I actually might have said that it was the funniest Transformers movie. When the comedy worked, I laughed. When it didn't work, I just didn't laugh. I didn't groan, though, and that was the important thing. Whereas Transformers 3 really got on my nerves, and I was like, oh my god, that was stupid. But in Transformers 4's case, it just... it seemed like it wasn't trying too hard to appeal to teenagers. It wasn't as raunchy or as silly as the previous Transformers films were. So I usually appreciated its style of humor, and then when it didn't work, at least it didn't piss me off. The special effects and action scenes are as top-notch as always. It is kind of interesting to see how the action has improved throughout the course of these films, because my problem with the first Transformers, or one of my problems with it, was the camera work was always so shaky and the editing was overly tightened, so it was often disorienting when it came to the action scenes. But as the technology improved, they were able to do a lot more with the special effects. I always presumed that, even though they could do a good job at doing these awesome CGI creations, but they couldn't do a whole lot with them without, making the Transformers look fake, losing the illusion that you're actually watching giant robots. Whereas, each film progressed and the budgets increased and technology improved, so they could do more with the CGI Transformers. And so yeah, this is top of the line stuff. I loved the action scenes. I never found them to be overly noisy or disorienting. I will say that Michael Bay occasionally undermined the emotions of certain scenes with his attempts to be Michael Bay. Like, there's this one part where Hound, played by John Goodman, he has a last stand sequence where he and Mark Wahlberg are fighting off all these different Transformers, and the way the music's done and the way the camera is moving, it is a fairly powerful sequence that totally loses all of its emotional impact by having Hound continue to talk and yell out one-liners. They should have just drowned out all dialogue, focused entirely on the action and Mark Wahlberg's facial expressions, and it would have been much better. But this, as I said, it's not a good movie, but I did think it was well paced. The action starts quickly enough. I could tolerate the human interactions, and even though I thought it was too long, I never felt it burnt itself out. So I enjoyed Transformers 4, even though I'm a little concerned that it will be one of those cases where once I watch it on DVD, suddenly the novelty of the strengths will wear off once more and I'll only pay attention to the flaws. So keep that in mind. I'd say watch Transformers 4 based on, I don't know, your feelings towards the rest of the films. If you hated those films and you were like, alright, well, I'm done now, I'd say wait till DVD, just play it safe. If you liked the previous Transformers films, then go ahead and watch this in theaters. But I liked it more than the original trilogy, so take that as you will. I did not do a written review of this, but I did do written reviews of Hostel 2, Daughter of Darkness, which is a Category 3 Hong Kong flick, and my next one will be In the Name of the King 3, an Uwe Boll movie, so that should be delightful. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I apologize for the length, and I'll see you guys later.